Welcome back. You're watching The Capital Point. If you're joining us online, the hashtag is The Capital Point. Do follow us on @Metropole TV Kenya. I'm now joined in studio with Godwin Simba, the MD of Octagon Pension Services. Thank you so much for making time to be on Metropole TV. Now, of course, the issue of pensions, touches each and every human being, especially because at one point we have to retire, whether it's because of age or illness or work. So we have, as a country, 1.3 trillion shillings in pension funds. It seems quite a big number, but in terms of GDP or in terms of share of GDP, it should be higher. What is your deduction of where we are as the state of the industry?
Yeah. Thank you, Terry, for having me for this session to just elaborate more about the retirement benefits industry. The retirement benefits industry at large has really been on a growth path when you look at it from the last 10 or 15 years. We've been actually in the industry has moved tremendously from a low of 100 billion to, at the moment, you're talking about 1.3 trillion in terms of the fund sizes. And this ideally represents close to 15% of the GDP. The reason for growth has been the need or the sensitization in the market regarding the pension savings, as well as also you notice that when it comes to pension coverage, we still, of course, not where we are supposed to be, because you're talking about close to 19% of pension coverage in the Kenyan market. Comparatively to the most developed economies, you're talking about over 100% when it comes to GDP. And essentially, the pension industry really plays a key role in the economy because it fuels investments into the capital markets. Yeah, you also find the pension industry invests a lot in property and also private equity. So there's a critical role which the pension industry plays. And the more that we have funds in the economy, then you may see a higher growth rate in terms of the economic GDP. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just if we can split that 1.3 trillion, 1.16 is in private pension funds.
You're right.
0.2 is in the public pension fund, which is NSSF.
Yes.
Why is there such a huge disparity between the two?
Over a long time, most of the pension savings has actually been driven through NSSF for the longest time. NSSF was enacted in 1964. And in those very old days, people used to contribute as low as 100 shillings. Now, over time, NSSF has started to improve its own contributions, but at the moment, we are still at a ceiling of 200 shillings per contribution from an employee and 200 shillings from an employer perspective. So when you look at the growth of the NSSF funds, it's not been substantial enough. And comparatively to the private sector pension funds, you're looking at almost 31% of the funds in the NSSF funds being the total of the pension assets, and about 61% coming from the employer's pension savings. Now, the reason why you've seen the employers or the occupational schemes growing faster, or the private pension schemes growing faster, is the fact that the contribution rates in employer-sponsored schemes are always high. And the average in the market is currently standing at around 7.5% to around 10% from employer and employee perspective in terms of contributions. You even find in civil service or parastatals, they contribute as high as 10% and 20% from both employer and employee perspective. Mm-hmm. So that has really driven the assets in the pension industry quite a lot. Mm-hmm. The NSSF as well has also tried to increase the coverage of the membership. We're talking about close to 3 million Kenyans, both in both the private and in the NSSF membership portfolio. And ideally, you realize that for every 2 in 3 people who are employed, most of them are actually in NSSF. So you find members who are in NSSF funds are also members in the private pension schemes. Mm. So that also can tell you the fact that as you look at the numbers deeply, the 3 million people are actually people in the formal employment. So there's actually a more need to discuss more about those who are in the informal sector as well.
Absolutely, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But I want to break down a little bit some of the investments, and you alluded to the impact or the impact the pensions industry could have on the economy as a whole. Just looking at how these pension funds are invested, 35% in government bonds.
Yes, right.
20% in listed companies, 19% in property, 14% in guaranteed bonds, and the remainder about 12% in bonds, deposits, some offshore, etc. What are some of the new areas that these funds need to look at?
Over the years, we've seen most pension funds investing in traditional investments. These are what you've listed: government bonds, stocks, corporate bonds, as well as short and long-term, call and fixed deposits for that fact. But then increasingly, pension funds have become more agile to new investments. We're seeing more focus towards infrastructure investments, such as public-private partnerships, which actually more focuses on infrastructure investments. We've also seen schemes moving into new asset classes that the capital markets have, rolled in the market, like derivatives for this purpose. We've also seen rates being rolled out by the capital markets over the last 2 years. So pension funds have also increasingly moved into that. And again, why the drive for the move has been because you find the investments in the pension funds have been a bit volatile. So if you look at the equity investments for the last three or so years, we've actually not been performing very well at an average of perhaps 5% return. And members who are retiring are demanding more of, a good return. And therefore, trustees or the people who manage pension funds are actually on a high, search for stable and high return investments.
Talking of stability, the government seems to have identified, that pot of gold in as far as the Big Four agenda is concerned. But we've seen some fund managers saying, developing cold feet and being apprehensive about it, saying we are not sure about the risks associated with that. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think that the investment into public-private partnerships is quite a good area to look at. If you look at most developed economies and also most of the big pension funds in the world, even in South Africa, the government pension fund for South Africa, they've done quite a lot on private-public partnerships. It was quite a new area when you look at it from the Kenyan perspective, because it's quite a new area that the trustees are trying to understand, also the industry trying to understand. And that also is more driven by the legal framework existing for pension schemes to actually invest. And remember that these pension funds are ideally members' funds. And the first priority or objective for any pension fund is to preserve the capital that this member has contributed into. So that means you have to really be cautious when you're taking risks, in as much as you also want to balance the return perspective. So you find that pension funds are a bit cautious, looking at the legal framework, looking at the risks, and by then, if you look at the introduction of that asset class, we're still at the early stages, and I think there's a lot of awareness that needs to be done, in as much as also we are assessing the legal framework to support the objective of pension funds.
Let's talk about coverage of pension funds, specifically with the SME space, where the majority of Kenyans today are actually employed by. However, many of them are not formal, and even though NSSF is supposed to be mandatory, the majority of SMEs do not actually pay to NSSF for their members of staff. In what ways can the SME space get more engaged?
When you look at the current statistics in the market, the coverage rate, as mentioned, is around 19%. Now, out of the 19%, we do have close to 14, 15 million Kenyans who are in both formal and informal space. So that tells you have close to only 3 million saving for pension. There's been need for the sector to look at the informal sector, employers, and trying to create some awareness about saving for retirement. The key challenge that has been, of course, faced in the Kenyan market is the fact that pension is always a long-term objective. Secondly, pension has always been seen as a voluntary benefit that the employers normally put in place. So there has to be a sensitization between the employees on the need to save for retirement, and also for employers in the SMEs to look at pension as a key motivator towards retention and recruitment of the employees. And also, coming back to the informal sector, these are individuals who perhaps do not have a structured saving. So the industry also needs to look at the aspect of creating products that are actually centered around the informal sector. And this would be driven by technology, instead of the mortar and brick where people have to walk in to be serviced and all that. And there's quite a lot of developments around that space, right, from the launch of Mobikeza, the launch of Mbawa Pension Plan and all that. So coming to look at it from a perspective of adequacy and sustainability of retirement benefits for the Kenyan population, we are currently speaking about close to 37% to around 40% old age poverty rates currently. So meaning even the people who are actually in retirement at the moment, they are not enjoying a good life in as much as you're having a small pension coming through. So those are the conversations that the industry is really looking at and trying to say, how can we net off now? How can we bring into the net these more than 15 million people or 14 million people who are actually ideally are supposed to be saving for pension?
Let's, some of our viewers are, SMEs, and probably wondering, why should I really care? What would you tell an SME who's an employer?
Yes.
Why should they care?
My advice would be to look at that employee from a perspective of when he leaves retirement, when he leaves employment. On average, most people actually work between age 25 and age 60 years. There's a high likelihood that that particular individual would work for you until age 60 years, which is close to 30 years. But then the probability is also high that the same person would be able to live for another 30 years. He only has those 30 years is working for you as an SME to be able to accumulate something sustainable for them to take care of old age. And when you look at the aspect of promoting life in retirement, it's actually a conversation that begins from the employment perspective. Why would an employer, for example, care for your medical, get you medical now when you're working, or probably get you good perks, get you a good pay, but then immediately you leave employment, you become destitute in employment. You don't have any income to sustain you. That's when medical challenges crop in, and probably also you find old age support systems are no longer sustainable, so you find that people are on their own. So for an SME who has employees, I think the care should be more about the current benefits that are for pre-employment, but also should extend to post-employment. Yes.
And what's the role of the individual, let's say the employee,
yes,
who may be working for an SME that's not paying NSSF, for instance? What can they do to encourage, what are some of the conversations they can start having with their employers?
I would encourage them to, as an individual, you first have to have your retirement goal as an individual. First of all, try to understand what happens after employment, and not even nowadays after employment, because there are many risks that comes in before you even get to the retirement age. There's a risk that you can lose your employment before you get to your retirement age. There's a risk that probably the investments that you have done may actually be utilized for other pre-retirement, expenditure, like now education. You're focusing on education, you're focusing on housing, and also personal upkeep. But then you have to look and say, what is life beyond the employment that you have? And that would be answered if you start having a retirement goal or a long-term goal towards your savings. You may want to invest, for example, even if you invest in a SACCO, for example, which I see majority of people, SACCOs are more popular in terms of savings. But then SACCOs normally are aimed to achieve the short-term needs. You may want to borrow, for consumption, buying a plot, property, and all that. But then the long-term nature of it is that at some point you will retire, and you need to have accumulated enough funds to take you for even more than 20 to 30 years of your retirement life. Currently, maybe just to look into the statistics of longevity, our current, we are looking at people currently living at an average age of 74 years. So meaning you have like 15 years on average, if God allows you to stay more than 60 years to live. You still want to maintain the same standards of living. So those conversations need to happen at an individual level and to start from saving. So have a conversation with your employer, and if your employer is not is not ready at that moment to start contributing for retirement, there are so many personal pension plans in the market. There are close to almost 30 registered personal pension plans. For example, we run an Octagon personal pension plan that has close to 5,000 individuals, and we launched a product for the informal sector 2 months ago, where we have onboarded close to more than 10,000 individuals within 2 months because of the flexibility that comes with the technology.
How much? What's the minimum for your pension plan?
We're looking at actually no minimum. You can actually deposit as low as 1 shilling through your mobile phone, and it's a product we have called it Mobikeza. It's quite a convenient product that if you're out there and you're an individual who you want to start saving for your retirement, you don't have to wait for your employer. Just put it in your funds through your USSD platform and start saving for retirement. Yeah.
That's interesting because there have been campaigns I've seen, especially at community level, where people who have house girls or nannies or gardeners and watchmen being told you need to start contributing or encouraging your staff within the household to also start thinking about their future.
Right.
So another question that comes to mind with this is the rise of the gig economy, the future of work as it's called, where reports and research is showing that in the next couple of years, many young people will not be or even want to be in the formal economy. What will this do to the formal pension system?
Yeah. First, it probably, when you look at the key risks we are addressing currently in the current structure we have, is actually to address the population that we have currently, the current workforce that we have. There are emerging trends that are really either they may work for or against, but ideally sometimes if you don't plan well as an individual, it may work against you. Key example is the gig economy you've mentioned. These are individuals that would not want to stay in a job for a long period of time. You probably don't want to go into a formal employment. What does that have an impact towards your savings? It's because then if you don't structure your savings well from start, when you start earning that income, it doesn't have to be a payroll. It could just be that you've gone to that gig, you get some money. You must start having the discipline of starting to look at and say, out of every income I earn, how much should I be saving? And we advise everyone in that particular cluster to save at least 10% on the bare minimum and let the 90% of your other income, you use it for other reasons. But then when you look at the impact of that to the current savings is that most of the savings that we currently have in the pension space, in the pension sector, are actually savings that have been accrued from people who are in formal employment, long-term formal employment. So meaning if people lose employment or you opt to go for short-term contracts and all that, you potentially lose out from the structure. And therefore, that would mean that you, as an individual, you have to look at how do you balance that by enrolling into a private pension scheme that you can contribute into.
All right. Now, members of parliament, clearly not friends of the pensions industry, have decided to scrap the age limit.
Right.
What will this do to whatever is already there, given that if we look at this year alone and what has happened in terms of job losses, retrenchments, and many of these people will want now to go and access their funds.
Yes.
So what happens now?
Ideally, when the regulations came in June to actually preserve the employer portion of the funds that members have contributed to the scheme until the retirement age, the industry looked at it as a welcome move because then it was going to promote the longevity or the sustainability and the adequacy of pension funds for these members. The challenge that we face as an industry has been where members are actually putting in money to the pension fund. And when you look at the percentage of the funds they are putting into is close to around 5%. So ideally when members of the pension funds contribute, we actually take out almost 5% of their salary. Which goes into the pension fund. So they are left with the other 95%. Now, the portion that the employer is contributing is ideally a voluntary contribution. So the perception has always been that the employer portion, even if you are allowed to access your employee portion as an individual, plus the income that has accrued, at least the one that is been accrued from the employer's side should actually hold on until when you get to 50 years. Which we saw that would have actually promoted, adequacy of the funds in retirement. But then I think because, of course, we live in an economy which people have, they have to express their, there's what we call public participation, which members felt that, it may not be wise to lock the employer portion, and that portends a big risk, actually, to most members who have saved for pension. Ideally, when you look at the current withdrawals that we pay out to individuals, we pay out close to, because the employer portion tend to be higher than the employee portion in most cases. So that means the current people exiting from the funds, they actually access a bigger portion from the employer portion. So that means then you are likely to have a big risk coming in retirement.
So what advice do you have for somebody who maybe has lost a job?
Yes.
They have a pension scheme in place, and they are thinking, now that I may need some money in the short term, I can go and withdraw, now that the rule, as is this particular rule is in place.
Yes.
So what advice would you have for them?
I would advise that as soon as you set in to start saving for pension, just put it in your mind that it's a long-term investment. It's a long-term saving. It's not a short-term saving. In the unfortunate event you lose your job, and you still of a working age, you still have the energy to work. Perhaps you're looking at people who are below 50 years. What you may want to do as the first priority is just to assume that that money for pension is not there, because that was not the intended objective. In as much as you're allowed to withdraw, the first thing you probably need to do is that look at for other alternative sources of income that you can sustain yourself in the meanwhile as you look for employment or alternative means of sustaining yourself. But then in the event you have to access your benefits, look at it from a point of view where you are accessing it for a purpose of purposes of investment, not for purposes of running, your day-to-day, needs. Because then, if you lock out the pension funds from the scheme, it means then you are losing out on the interest. And normally, pension funds have given an average of around 12 to 13% income for the last 10 years, if you look at the average statistics in the market. So even if you are going to do investments which is outside the pension space, just look at the risk and the return that comes with it. Because we've seen most people who leave employment, the first thing they get that letter that you are leaving employment, they want to actually withdraw that money. And withdrawing that money has a bigger risk, because then the intended purpose will not be achieved.
As we wind up, what's your outlook for 2020 for the pensions industry?
Perhaps to look at it from an industry perspective, we saw the regulator, Retirement Benefits Authority, launching a strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan, quite an ambitious one. And we believe that it sets the tone for the industry in terms of coverage. We're seeing more of conversations coming around increasing awareness, and we are likely to see more uptake of pension products from outside the formal sector employees. So we pretend, and we are likely also to see more informal sector employers, coming in, informal sector employers and also employees coming in to add into the basket of retirement savings. The second thing that we are very positive about is the investment outlook. We've seen quite some stable economic outlook in the Kenyan market. However, when you look at the returns that the pension funds have been getting over the last few years, 3 years or so, it hasn't been quite attractive as such. But over the last 2 months, we've seen a rise in terms of returns from equities, government bonds. So we potentially look at a future where the returns will be more attractive for people actually to retain their funds in the retirement benefits industry. The last thing that we are more, that I'm personally convinced, the fact that there are products that are coming out in the market that are more attractive for any individual to save for retirement. With the use of technology that we do have on a day-to-day basis, I would advise individuals to be on the lookout for products that would give you convenience, comfort, and also it will be more easier for you to enroll in terms of pension, as well as look also for products that would also give you pension and also augment it with insurance. Because there's one thing to save for pension, and you insure that risk that you are likely to live for long. But also there is the element that you want to safeguard yourself just in the event something happens before you retire. And that would mean then you may want to take a life cover. You may also want to make sure that your families are safeguarded by ensuring that you have put in place a document or a will that would ideally protect your loved one. So as we move towards more sensitization, there's more to discuss around embedding the pension products, especially to serve the formal and the informal sector, with insurance products, so that you are giving a bouquet of quite some comfort or security in retirement.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your insights and for making time to be with us on the Capital Point. I have been speaking with Godwin Simba, the MD of Octagon Pension Services. You've been watching The Capital Point. My name is Terry Ann Chebet. Have a good night.